So I myself, of course, work in complex chronic illnesses as well, but I don't really work with the cancer part so much. I try to prevent them from getting to that point, hopefully. What brought you to working with cancer itself? Because it presents its own unique challenges for sure. I mean, it's like if complex chronic illnesses aren't hard enough, now you're dealing with sometimes even, terminal illnesses or illnesses with not a great maybe we don't know what the prognosis really is, and sometimes they're not great. There's still a lot we can do for this. So,
Yeah.
what brought you to that particular field of study and practice?
It's a really good question. I don't know that there was ever any one thing that was like, I'm going to go really focus and specialize and study cancer to almost, the exclusion of that's what the bulk of my practice is going to be. I have my own personal cancer story in my family, and I lost my grandmother to breast cancer. She had her first little lump when I was in high school, had a lumpectomy, bunch of radiation, was offered some hormone modulating meds after the fact. She didn't take them. She didn't like the side effects. And then nothing for 10, 12 years, and then had a recurrence. And it was metastatic. It had spread. It was pretty much everywhere by the time she found it. And there wasn't a whole lot, she declined chemotherapy. She was just sort of was given a short amount of time and wanted to spend that time with grace, which I absolutely respect. And when she had her recurrence, I was in medical school. So I was in year 3 of my 5-year program. So as you know, I knew just enough about medicine to have a bunch of great ideas that I could not actually apply to my own family in any way that made any sense, right? But I did, while I'm watching my grandmother kind of struggle with accepting her diagnosis, struggle with even just the side effects of her pain care meds, her comfort meds, that got really constipated, was really uncomfortable, wound up in the hospital with impacted stool, right? And it was just like, oh, if I or anyone on our team ahead of time had said, oh, we're going to give you a bunch of opiates, let's also give you a stool softener, let's pay attention. So it was kind of seeing her experience and seeing where it was like, oh gosh, some bone broth I think would have gone a long way, or just these little things we could have done in the moment, always kind of stayed with me.
Or
Once I got into practice, I spent my first couple of years just doing very general stuff with no intention of really specializing yet, and then joined the clinic that I met you at up here in Northern California. And coincidentally, the doctor who I was being hired to replace was the cancer specialist. And she was leaving to join another practice. And then there were all these cancer patients left. And so I basically joined the practice and was kind of offered this, like, well, we can send you to some seminars and we can get you up to speed in the oncology world if you're willing to take on these patients. So I sort of walked into a just add water situation. It also meant I had to get up to speed really fast, because all of a sudden I had a bunch of folks who were at all stages of treatment, diagnosis, not a bunch, but some residual, a bunch for me. And I had to get really hip really fast to what they were already doing, what they could, how we could adjust those treatment plans. So I learned a tremendous amount of how to support our oncology patients from my predecessor's chart notes, right? Dr. Young, who I work with now, so much I learned just from reading her notes and figuring out why she did that. And then going back to the textbooks and the, Neil McKinney's textbook, and what are my other ones? The really foundational, the Lisa Auschler, the Definitive Guide to Cancer, Paul Anderson's books, the Think Outside the Box. And then, of course, kind of through all of that, being in the integrative oncology world for a few years, then kind of got into this metabolic approach to cancer and did that additional training with Dr. Winters, which our whole clinic has done that training now. So we're all metabolic approach practitioners, which is,
oh, right on.
Dr. Alden finished hers. Nikki was cohort 1, I was cohort 3, and Dawn was cohort 5.
Oh wow, yeah, I didn't know that Dr. Alden had done that. Don, yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah.
I hear really good things about that particular training.
Oh,
Um,
it's tremendous.
So
Yeah.
yeah, I imagine this is quite challenging in any field, honestly, but with any complex chronic oncology included, how do you have to really be almost constantly learning, and you have to be willing to sort of change your models and paradigms. how do you personally navigate that space? Because it's can be a little overwhelming sometimes. What I did last year, might be different than what I'm doing
Yeah.
this year in
And
terms
I
of
have to be
philosophy or
willing to have a conversation with the patient. Sorry to cut you off. I have to be willing to have a conversation with the patient and say, hey, I know I recommended this a year ago, but now I'm not recommending it anymore because I've read this and I've had these conversations and I actually don't think it's appropriate. Or in some regards, in the oncology world, it seems like things aren't moving quickly enough at all. And in other regards, things are moving really fast, right? So from the patient's end, it's like we can't get enough new treatment options quickly enough. On the clinician's end, it's like we're introducing new biologics, new treatments, new things all the time. And we're weaving in these new tools, and then we have to figure out how they fit into this sort of really complicated system we already have going. And then, as you know, with a complex chronic disorder, we have the mental emotional picture of our patients as well, because like the folks you see have been ill for a long time, and they very frequently have been failed by the medical system in a bunch of different ways by the time they land in your lap, right? Not intentionally. And then the folks I'm working with have just received this diagnosis that is rocked their world, right? Being able to show up and be present for my patients in a way that is holding their space without fear in the room, even though, right, this is a fearful situation. Cancer, the word cancer strikes fear, right? I mean, it doesn't. We could get the most mild little benign cancer diagnosis and it still is going to rock that patient. It's a lot to kind of not only stay on top of my field clinically, but also bring that emotional space to each patient interaction and each patient encounter. And it's tough, right? It takes a lot. I don't see patients more than 3 days a week, and that's intentional because I need those other days to kind of recharge and rejuvenate myself, because it is I give a lot more in those encounters than I do with my thyroid patients, right? Are folks that are like, oh, your tummy doesn't feel good. Okay, we're going to get through this. It's a very different experience. So
Yeah,
yeah.
R, rest, rejuvenation, and research. I mean, I think I end up doing
Yeah.
a lot of research on my off days too, just,
Yeah.
reading stuff and trying to keep up on things. And
Yeah.
sometimes I find that relaxing, honestly, but not everybody does.
I,
You need to kind of cut yourself off too. So
yeah.
self-care is incredibly important, but
Yeah.
I really appreciate what you said about supporting people emotionally and supporting them through their fear and through their traumas. Most of our patients have had past traumas, anything from childhood to ancestral to
Yeah.
medical. Most of it is medical. Most of what we're navigating is in the medical sphere because they've seen other practitioners, other people who haven't listened to them maybe, or who've spent 5 minutes with them and didn't hear them or gaslighted them, all this kind of stuff. It's just crazy. So I really appreciate you holding that space for these people because that's not an easy thing to do, I think. And it's
Yeah.
not part of our, unfortunately, I'm sorry to say, I'm not saying there aren't practitioners in the conventional sphere that do this, but most of the time, the way the system works, they don't have the time and the space to do this. So it's really not always that we're blaming the individual, but it's a systemic issue that needs to change.
Totally agree. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's, I so appreciate when I hear, people talking about this. Like I didn't ask you that question, you just brought it up, like
Yeah.
that's lovely.
Thank you. Yeah. Yeah. And I think, in that regard, the practitioners that I see have the most long-term success are the folks that are connecting with their patients in that mental, emotional, and that physical, right? And it doesn't mean I'm trying to step in and play therapist. I absolutely am not. I do not want that role, but I fully acknowledge that if we don't work in that world, then we're not going to make the progress we want, sort of addressing physiology or so as we're all so interconnected.
Yeah, no, that's amazing.